So very quick overview of Portland Analytics. So we are a affinity partner of FOS. We're a fuel consultancy. So we specialize in working with commercial fuel buyers on primarily on fuel procurement strategy. So things like setting up supply agreements between buyers and obviously the suppliers. We do that through procurement review and strategy. We do managed tender services, and over the last few years, we've done a lot on alternative fuels transition as well. So helping companies move away from fossil fuel onto alternatives such as HVO. We also do training sessions. So, for example, procurement training for any staff that are obviously looking at buying fuel. We can train them up, and market reporting, which obviously the likes of this sort of content that we're going through today. You may also know us as the former owner now of Portland Pricing. So that's a fuel price information service that we did run in partnership with FOS. We've sold that to a company called MyAutomate, who are continuing to run that service as it used to run. They're also partnered with FOS, so some of you may know the name from that service. And finally, we're part of a wider group of companies under the Portland umbrella, including things like physical fuel supply, fuel hedging. I've been with the company for 10.5 years, and I've kind of moved around all of the companies within the group. But for the last 7 years, I've been specialising in procurement consultancy. So start with a recap on HVO and what it is. So the term HVO refers to hydrotreated vegetable oil, and that is basically an umbrella term for all kinds of renewable fuels that are produced from a process known as hydroprocessing. It's not just exclusively vegetable oil, which I'll come on to in a sec. But you might also see it referred to as HEFA, which is hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. So that's a more of a catch-all term. As I say, because it's not all just made from vegetable oil feedstock. And as I'm sure you'll be aware, it's a low greenhouse gas alternative to conventional fossil fuels. So yes, diesel and gas oil, that can be used as a direct replacement for them, can also be reused as a replacement for kerosene in heating and that sort of thing. So in terms of the feedstocks that it can be made from, like I say, not just vegetable oil or chip fat, it can be made from crop products, so things like rapeseed, but also from waste oils. So you've got used cooking oil, tallow, so waste animal fat, and some other waste products such as there's a product called palm oil malefolent, which is emerging over the last couple of years as being a feedstock used in the HVO process. That's the one that's kind of come under a bit of pressure recently, as I mentioned, this BBC article that I'll talk about later. But that's a waste product from the palm oil production process, and that is also so used to make HVO. But yeah, you might also just see it referred to as renewable diesel. So I think as more feedstocks are being used, the term HVO is probably appearing less, but clearly it's the term everybody knows. In terms of the benefits of using it, so the key one is that it's a drop-in alternative. So by drop-in, that means that it can be used as a direct replacement for diesel. So you can put it straight into a diesel tank, you can burn it in a diesel engine with no modifications or updates. I've got an asterisk there because you should obviously check with your vehicle manufacturers that it won't void any warranties, but most of them now are accepting HVO as a diesel replacement. A few things on spec. So the spec for HVO is slightly different to diesel. So the spec is EN 15940, which is for paraffinic diesel. That's HVO's spec, versus diesel, which is obviously EN 590. So if you are checking with your manufacturers, the spec to be checking is, will you accept EN 15940? And in terms of blending, obviously I mentioned you can use it as a 100% kind of replacement for diesel, but you can also use it as a blend. So you can mix HVO and diesel in a storage tank, or you can put it into a vehicle that's still got diesel in the tank. It will stay on spec at EM590 to roughly about 25% HVO content. Anything above that, it moves into the paraffinic diesel spec. So again, just things to bear in mind when you're checking use in your vehicles. The benefits: the GHG emissions reductions are obviously lower than fossil fuels. So you've got GHG emissions reductions of up to 87%, depending on the feedstock that the HVO is made from. So I've got a table on the right-hand side there that just shows you the GHG performance versus fossil diesel. And you can see that the waste products that I mentioned, so tallow, palm oil mill effluent, and used cooking oil, they're the three that have the best performance in terms of GHG reductions. And by life cycle reductions, that refers to the reductions across the production process of the fuel, right to the point at which you're burning it in your engine. Reduction in tailpipe emissions as well, which leads to a reduction in your AdBlue consumption. So just to kind of clear up the difference between HVO and other biodiesels. So the UK's had biodiesel blended within its standard diesel for many years now, but it's capped at 7%. And the reason for that is the performance of first generation biodiesels, which are called methyl esters. So the most common one that you may have come across is a product called FAME, fatty acid methyl ester. But there are other methyl esters such as used cooking oil methyl ester, which is used in the UK market a lot. Now they can only be blended up to about 7%. Any higher than that, and they risk clouding up in cold weather, so it risks the performance of the fuel. HVO doesn't have that issue, so it can be blended up to 100%, as I say, because it's got a much lower CFPP, which is the cold filter plugging point. So that's the point at which it starts to cloud up in cold weather. FAME will start, depending on the grade of FAME, it will start clouding up from anywhere from 0 degrees to -10 degrees. HVO is a much lower temperature before it starts clouding, so no issues with that kind of with the weather in this country. It's also got a higher cetane number, which is better for ignition performance. But because it's got lower density, consumption might be affected slightly. Although that's kind of up for debate depending on your fleet. And I know Garrett's had his own experience with consumption that he'll talk about in a couple of minutes' time. And then this kind of just puts it all into perspective. So these are based on figures from the UK government. So these are figures for HVO used to meet the RTFO, which I'm going to talk about later on, but that's the biofuel obligation in the UK. And you can see that, you know, particularly over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, demand for HVO for use in the UK road sector has rocketed. So based on the latest provisional figures for 2024, it's risen to just under 800 million litres of HVO demand. I think that figure will probably increase by the time they finalise the 2024 figures, but you know that chart kind of shows it all. The reason for the increase in demand is because, in terms of decarbonising your fuel consumption, clearly HVO is the easier option because it can be used as a direct drop-in. And then I've also included a chart that just shows you kind of feedstock trend in the UK. So as you can see, the vast majority of product of HVO that is supplied to the UK is derived from used cooking oil feedstock. You can see it's over 92%. The rest are other waste products. So I mentioned palm oil mill effluent, pommy. I mentioned tallow. There's another waste product called spent bleaching earth. The important thing from this chart is that they are all waste products. So you'll notice I mentioned obviously it can be made from the likes of rapeseed and other crop feedstocks. But in the UK market, there's no demand for crop-based HVO. It's all waste-based, and the reason for that is that waste-based HVO has a much better performance in terms of GHG reduction. So yeah, just a couple of charts to kind of show you some up-to-date UK trends there. So if I go on to the next slide, I'll let Geraint take over for a little bit and talk through kind of his experiences of transitioning to HVO.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Geraint Davis, FORS Director. I've been in this role now for the last 2 years. Time flies when you're having fun and all that. But previous to that, for 22 years, I was at a company called John Raymond Transport, part of the Nolan Group. And for much of that 22 years, I found myself buying fuel. We had 120 tractor units, 220 odd trailers, all 44 ton, running UK distribution, mainly in and around the Midlands, a little bit of continental, but primarily UK, almost glorified supermarket trolleys then. For example, in COVID, we were carrying a lot of toilet paper. Toilet paper was a lot of what we did for Tesco and the like. I wasn't the king of rock and roll, I was the king of toilet roll. So there you go. So yeah, we run primarily 44 ton 6x2 tractor units, and I'm very aware of the challenges and the costs faced by operators, and how minor fluctuations in the fuel market, and even if you have got a fuel surcharge in place, how that can impact your bottom line. My buying habits typically would have been 2 to 3 road tankers a week. I had large bulk tanks in South Wales and in the Midlands as well. And the emphasis really was for drivers to fuel at those sites. But we also had fuel cards, and I'd buy fuel through the likes of Portland, and I'd put that into the pipe, as it were, and then draw off that on my fuel cards for the rest of the UK, or if you ended up in Scotland or far out East Anglia, something like that. Had a dabble with LNG trucks probably 20 years ago. Had some Fodens running on LNG with Cat C12 engine and Scania 3 Series. But the thing is, with those vehicles, you need a fuel infrastructure behind it, and you need the driver buy-in and the vehicle itself. And the good thing with HVO, it is the lowest of low-hanging fruit when it comes to fuels. I was very mindful. We were an asset-based business, for many years. Nolan Group are asset-based, so that means you buy your truck outright and then depreciate it over a longer period of time. So I remember the very last brand new trucks I bought were some DAF XFs and some Mercedes Actros, and I was confident that and I think one of them actually said on the fuel cap, you can run it on HVO, not a problem. So I was, and that was in 2021, and I was happy and confident. I wasn't concerned about those, but I had some older Volvo FHs, and again some XFs that we'd had from brand new, but they were 12 and 13 plates, and they were done. They'd done approaching 1.8, 2 million kilometers. So my concern was, am I going to have pump problems? I'm going to have injector problems. Am I going to have seals, issues with seals? And I was very closely involved with the workshop. We were very fortunate to have our own IRT approved workshop on site, so I was quite in tune to what was happening, and we didn't have a lot of issues, to be fair, and we did a gradual transition. As Mike has already said, it is miscible with that. Yes, that is a word, with normal BSE and 590, because I thought, well, if I'm going to be spending 50-60k on a tanker or road diesel, as it was, with the VAT, and I get it wrong, it's not going to be conducive to my future, is it? So I gradually put in different tanks, and until it gradually built up. We never did get to the stage where we were 100% HVO, because we couldn't at the time get HVO and fuel cards. But what I did notice a little bit of a minor improvement in fuel economy in MPG, but a pleasant side effect was a reduction in AdBlue usage. And how that came about is because HVO runs cleaner, you can almost have a Euro 5 truck running as clean as a Euro 6. Um, and you use less AdBlue because the engine, through the NOx sensor and other things, it senses that you're producing less NOx, therefore it draws less AdBlue. So we were actually using less AdBlue, which was quite a pleasant side effect. But like I said, because we weren't 100%, we couldn't say it was 100%. We didn't yield 100% of the benefits because we were having to put fuel in up the road on the fuel cards. So that was something that we did notice. But as the drop in fuel and customers wanting, well, what are you doing, Geraint? What is your company doing to reduce your or for your decarbonisation strategy? Well, HVO, like I said, is the lowest of low-hanging fruit because I'm very, very aware those trucks that I bought back in 2021, the same truck today is 35, 40 grand more for the same truck. A curtain-sided trailer is now getting on for 10 grand more to what it was. Costs are increasing. And there is a place for other vehicle architectures, but it all comes at a cost. And when operators are under massive pressure, HVO is a good stopgap. I think I'll hand back to you now, Mike.
Thanks, Geraint. Yeah, so it's good to kind of put some of this into context with your experiences. I think you mentioned the fuel card piece. So obviously we're not going to talk about kind of methods of supply in the UK in this presentation, but primarily still I would say that HVO, if you're gonna switch, you need to be looking at buying it in bulk, buying it into a bulk tank. The fuel card network coverage is improving, but it's still pretty patchy, I would say. So I think that'll change, obviously, as the network develops and more HVO becomes available. But for now, unless you've got an HVO filling site down the road from your depot, it would be very tricky to kind of switch to 100% HVO just using fuel cards. So one to bear in mind there. So I'm gonna talk through what's happened in the market now. So I'll start with a price chart just to kind of show you where things are at. So this chart shows the wholesale price of HVO in Northwest Europe. So some of you may be aware, diesel and other refined products that we buy in the UK, they're priced off the Northwest European wholesale market. So the HVO Northwest Europe price is a good kind of barometer for where that wholesale cost of HVO is at. Clearly, there is a massive spike in the middle of this chart, which I will talk about on the next slide. But if you kind of ignore that for a second, I guess the key takeaway from this is that over the last 12 months, you can see that there's a broad upward trend. So the increase in dollars per ton, so refined products are traded in US dollars per ton. Over the last 12 months, it's been roughly $400 a ton increase between now and last June. In terms of the pence per litre cost, $400 accounting for the exchange rate equates to about 20p a litre. So that's 20p per litre increase in the wholesale cost of HVO over the last 12 months. And there are a few reasons for that, which I've kind of outlined on this next slide. So first one is to do with the cost of feedstock. So obviously I've mentioned feedstocks on previous slides, and particularly used cooking oil. 92% of UK HVO consumption last year came from used cooking oil derived HVO. So obviously the cost of used cooking oil is going to have an impact on the cost of the refined HVO. But there are a few things kind of that have been driving this. So the first one would be export bans and anti-dumping tariffs, right? So I'll start with Indonesia. Indonesia is a big contributor, a big exporter of feedstock to the European biodiesel market, and talks about kind of these fraud concerns. So I'm going to kind of mention this now. There's been a lot of concern over the quality of the feedstocks that's been supplied, particularly to the European market. So feedstock has to come from waste. It's got a better GHG reduction if it comes from a waste product. So obviously there's an incentive for feedstock to be waste feedstock. And when you're looking at things like palm oil mill effluent versus palm oil, it's very hard to tell the difference between what's a waste feedstock and what's a pure palm oil feedstock. So Indonesia exports a lot of pommy, and one of the big kind of stories that came out was that the levels of pommy that were being claimed as going into the HVO market were roughly twice the global capacity to produce pommy. So that tells you what you need to know in terms of fraudulent claims. Clearly, if the amount that's being claimed is double the global production capacity, then some of that product is going to be fraudulent, and that's had a load of knock-on effects. So Indonesia put a ban on exports at the start of the year to address this. So a lot of Indonesian product there were concerns that it was being falsely claimed as being waste feedstock. There's also been an issue with the amount of feedstock coming in from China. So a couple of years ago, there's a lot of used cooking oil flooding the European market from China, and it meant biofuel prices kind of really, really declined due to this kind of glut of Chinese feedstock. So the EU introduced some anti-dumping tariffs on Chinese used cooking oil. So obviously that limits the supply. Both of these things are limiting the supply of feedstock that's going into the HVO supply chain, which therefore means that the cost of producing HVO has gone up because of limited feedstock supply. That's then had an impact on other biofuel markets. So the cost of other biofuels has gone up as the demand has increased. So you've got less used cooking oil available. You go to alternative feedstocks, and that pushes up the price of those feedstocks. So basically, you've seen a broad trend over the last 12 months of biofuel prices going up. So that's from kind of a supply side. From a demand side, there's also been an increase in the amount of biofuel that would be required to meet European biofuel obligations. So there's a piece of legislation called RED, the Renewable Energy Directive, which basically sets the targets for biofuel consumption in Europe. We're now on the third iteration of RED, so RED 3. RED 3 increased all of the targets again, and that came into effect from the 21st of May. But obviously, prior to that, everybody's been ramping up so the way that RED works is RED sets the target for Europe, and then it's up to each country to implement that into their own national law. So when RED 3 comes out, which was a couple of years ago now, each kind of territory then has to transition that into their law by increasing their own bio obligations. So long story short, bio obligations have been going up as a result of this. You've then, in recent months, there's been an uptick in pricing because of increased used cooking oil demand. So I mentioned first generation biodiesel, and I mentioned the limitations around using it in cold weather because of the clouding issues. So the summer is the perfect time to use these first generation biodiesels because the weather's warmer, so you're not going to have as many issues around clouding. So first generation biodiesel blending increases in the summer, which means that demand for used cooking oil, which can be used in both first generation and HVO, goes up, which again has seen prices kind of increase over the last few months. And then a really significant one around changes to the German and Dutch bio obligations. So I mentioned that each country has its own iteration of the RED kind of legislation. In Germany and the Netherlands, basically this is a response to the sheer amount of feedstock that came into Europe, as I mentioned, from China over the last couple of years, and the cost of meeting biofuels obligations was obviously really low as a result of the supply glut, which meant that the ticket market. So without kind of going into too much detail, when to meet your obligation, you blend biodiesel, you generate a certificate. Those certificates can be traded; they have a value. Those ticket markets collapsed, particularly in Germany and the Netherlands, which meant that they had a big reset. So there's a mechanism that allows you to roll over your compliance. So if you're over compliant in 1 year, you can roll that into the next year. Germany canned that for this year. So all the German obligations were basically reset at the start of this year. There was no rollover allowed. And in the Netherlands, they didn't quite go to those extents, but they reduced the amount of permitted rollover from 25% to 10%. So basically, all this over compliance as a result, like kind of hangover from this Chinese feedstock thing, it's kind of reset it, which has meant that all of a sudden there's been a kind of step increase in the demand for biofuel. So obviously, increased demand means higher prices. And then last couple of things to mention. So clearly that big spike that I showed on the previous slide, you can see here, it rocketed from around about $1,800 a ton to $2,700 a ton for 1 week in November. That was a kind of a perfect storm, but a lot of HVO production units went offline at that point. So I think it was 3 or 4 all went offline in the same week, and obviously there's just a big supply shock and prices just went through the roof. But it did then come back off pretty quickly after, as those production units came back online. And finally, just on certification. So I mentioned this piece about the feedstock fraud and concerns around that. There's an organization called the ISCC, who you may be aware of. The ISCC's job is basically to verify that the feedstocks that are going into biofuel in Europe and around the world are coming from a renewable source. So they go and verify the source that it's from. There's been obviously concerns around the ISCC's ability to do that effectively. As I mentioned, the piece on palm oil in particular, palm oil molecular. So as a result of these concerns, the ISCC has really kind of upped their game, or seemingly upped their game, and started withdrawing a lot of their verification. So nobody wants unverified product because they can't trace the GHG emissions reductions. So if verified product then becomes unverified, that removes it from the market. So the pool of available product becomes smaller, which means that the price of verified products goes up because obviously supply is tightened as a result of that. So there's a whole load of things that have been kind of meaning HVO prices have been trending upwards over the last 12 months. In terms of the UK market, got a chart here. Obviously, there's quite a lot on here, so I'll kind of talk through what all of this means. But the way that it works in the UK, I talked about certificates very briefly on the last slide. In the UK, we have our biofuel obligation is called the RTFO, the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation. And the way that works is for every litre of biofuel supplied to the UK market, a certificate is generated, which is called an RTFC, and that certificate can be used to cash it in against your obligation if you're a fuel supplier. Products that come from a waste feedstock generate 2 certificates for every litre, so there's the incentive for using waste over crop. The reason that's important for the UK HVO market is because HVO generates these certificates, but because it's 100% renewable product, HVO suppliers have no obligation on this product, right? So every litre of HVO that they're bringing in, they're generating two certificates that can be sold on to a fossil fuel supplier that has an obligation. So the value of those certificates has an impact on the cost of HVO in the UK because it can be netted off the wholesale price. Okay, so this chart shows you a few different things. The light blue line is the cost of HVO in Europe, wholesale HVO in Europe, converted into pence per litre. So it's just the same chart as before, but converted to pence per litre. The dark blue line here shows you the cost of diesel. And then the black line shows you the cost of HVO with those certificates removed. Okay. So you can see that there's a significant reduction in the cost of HVO to the UK market when you account for these certificates being taken off. And then finally, the dotted line here shows you the value of the certificate. So you can see value of the certificate goes up, which means the value of HVO relative to diesel comes down because you're getting a greater benefit for supplying it to the UK market. Now, as I've just showed on the previous chart, the cost of wholesale HVO has gone up, but as other biofuels have gone up as well, so has the certificate value. So it's kind of offset that a little bit for HVO buyers in the UK. The main comparison that you really want to be looking at in terms of transition is the black line versus the dark blue line, because this is HVO in the UK versus diesel in the UK. And you can see that at some points, as the certificate price has spiked, we've reached a point where diesel and HVO at some points has actually been at parity, but usually it trades at a premium. And you can see that currently the premium here between diesel and HVO is roughly about 14 pence per litre. So if you were to go out to the HVO spot market at the moment, obviously you have to account for things like supply costs and supplier margin on top of this, but you might be looking at somewhere in the region of 15 to 20p a litre above the price of diesel for HVO at the moment. And as I say, the kind of key trends to look at outside of the wholesale HVO price movement is how is the cost of the RTFC affecting that, because a higher RTFC price increases the benefit to the HVO buyer, so it kind of reduces that versus diesel. So UK market development. So this is very much specific to the UK kind of supply side. Impacts of Donald Trump has been pretty key, I would say. So the UK market, just to give you kind of some context, a lot of the products that was being used in the UK was coming from the US, and the reason for that is Europe and European countries, part of the EU, are subject to European anti-dumping tariffs on US biofuel. Once the UK exited the EU, the UK government scrapped those anti-dumping tariffs. So basically, the UK became one of the only markets for US HVO exports. So very quickly, the UK's key source of HVO went from being European HVO to being US HVO. Now, that has definitely started to change in the last kind of 6 months or so. So since Donald Trump became president again. Few reasons for that. So policy uncertainty. Under Biden, there was a lot of incentive for US biofuels producers to be making HVO. They get a big tax incentive called the Blenders Tax Credit, which expired at the end of 2024. And Trump's administration basically haven't replaced that. Now, very recently, as in the last sort of week or two, this replacement for the Blenders Tax Credit has been kind of announced, and it's looking like it's going to be introduced as part of the big beautiful bill. But crucially, it's not as high a tax incentive. So basically, the Blenders Tax Credit meant that for every litre of HVO produced by a US producer, they would get like a fixed, it was $1 per gallon fixed tax credit. The replacement isn't anywhere near as high as that. So there's a lot of uncertainty for US producers, which means that a lot of them have gone offline. Therefore, supply is tighter in the US. There's not as much to export, and it's meant that the price of US products has gone up. You then add into the mix with the tariffs on feedstock. So obviously, used cooking oil from China, used cooking oil being the main thing that's being used to produce US HVO. And under the new legislation, they'll only qualify for a tax exemption if it comes from North America. So again, your production costs have gone up. your tax credit has gone down. There's not that much incentive for US producers at the moment, which has meant that the cost of US products has gone up, and therefore there's no longer an arbitrage between US and Europe, where it was cheaper to get US products shipped to the UK, even with the higher shipping costs. Now things have kind of reverted back to where they were, and Europe is the key market again for UK HVO. I mentioned the increase in the value of RTFCs, so I won't kind of go over that again. But in terms of pricing mechanisms, so another trend in the UK, any of you that are buying HVO on a contracted basis, I would say you relatively likely to have had it fixed to the price of diesel. So you might have had a 12-month contract, for example, where you're able to buy at diesel plus, I don't know, 15, 20p, something like that. It seems like it's getting less attractive for suppliers to offer that mechanism. And we might now be in a world where maybe in the next sort of year or so, things will move to a prices being fixed to the actual reported wholesale price of HVO. So back to that chart that I kind of showed you before.
Is that almost like a Platts plus kind of
Yeah,
then?
yeah. So it wouldn't necessarily be Platts that publish the HVO number.
No.
There's a company called Argus that are probably a bit more established in the biofuel price reporting space. But yeah, absolutely. So you buy diesel on a Platts plus basis. What you might end up seeing is that HVO is offered on a HVO minus RTFCs plus margin basis. Okay. So again, if you are looking at contract mechanisms on buying HVO and somebody is proposing that you buy on an HVO benchmarked mechanism, it's really important to make sure that there's something in there to net off the value of the RTFCs. RTFCs are about 25p a litre at the moment. And as I mentioned, you get 2 if it's produced from waste. So we're talking about 50p of value there. So that's a 50p reduction in the cost of HVO if the certificates are accounted for. So yeah, contract mechanisms on buying HVO. Make sure RTFCs are in there. If in doubt, give us a call because we can help set those up. So onto the market outlook. A lot of this is going to be kind of the same things that have been affecting prices over the last 12 months are likely to continue. But I guess the first one is nobody knows where things are going to go with the US next. Obviously, the impact of tariffs has been bad for US production, used cooking oil in particular. That means that those feedstocks are looking like flowing into Europe instead. So, you know, if we've got more feedstock availability in Europe, then that could bring prices down a little bit. But certainly in terms of US exports to the UK, you know, the longer this issue around tariffs and the uncertainty around the bioproduction policy, as long as those two things continue, it's looking like the main source for UK products is going to continue to be Europe. So in terms of price drivers, the factors that we're looking at are mainly Europe-centric price factors rather than what's affecting the US. So that brings me on to the second point here, which is biofuel demand. As I mentioned, biofuel demand in Europe is set by the Renewable Energy Directive. All of those targets have increased, and that has now come into effect from the 21st of May. So, you know, there's going to be higher demand for biofuel. So if feedstock availability and production can't keep pace with that demand, then you likely see an increase in the wholesale cost. There's demand from other sectors as well. So sustainable aviation fuel, SAF is very, very similar in terms of the product makeup to HVO. They're a very similar product. SAF is just basically a more highly refined version of HVO. But I've talked about obligations in the road sector. There are obligations in the aviation sector as well, in the form of SAF mandates. So the European SAF mandate is called Refuel EU. The UK introduced its own SAF mandate, which came into effect from the 1st of January in this year. And then similarly in the maritime sector, there are obligations for maritime as well. So Fuel EU Maritime is the kind of legislation for that in Europe. The point of all of this is that there are biofuels obligations across many different sectors that all use the same feedstocks, right? So used cooking oil, again, I mentioned it a lot, but used cooking oil can be used as a feedstock to create any of these fuels. So clearly, the more mandates there are, the higher the demand is for that. And I think that could end up resulting in you're likely to see probably higher hydrotreated fuel costs like HVO, but also there's only so much feedstock available, so the technology is going to have to progress to be able to use other feedstocks. So one part of the UK SAF mandate, for example, it places a cap on heifer produced fuels. So the fact there's a cap on it means that to meet the SAF obligation in the UK, there has to be an advancement in technology to use other types of feedstock. So concern around feedstock availability is a big issue for HVO, but the legislation is also pushing advancements in technology to overcome that. So I guess watch this space, because we're a long way from having that new technology, but certainly it does exist. It's just not really commercially available at the moment. And then exchange rates. So this is another key kind of impact of Trump. The dollar has weakened against other currencies, which is a positive thing for buyers of fuel products in the UK. I mentioned that product is traded in dollars per ton. So the stronger the pound is against the dollar, the more buying power we have in the UK. So it reduces the cost of fuel in the UK. So over the last 12 months, the pound has gained 9 cents over the dollar. And the relative reduction in HVO cost, just purely based on exchange rate movement, 9 cents is relative to 8 pence per litre. So a better performing pound against the dollar has reduced the cost of HVO relatively by 8 pence per litre. So obviously that's a key factor to bear in mind. The exchange rate has a bigger impact than you might think. And if there continues to be uncertainty over Trump's policies, which affects the performance of the dollar, then obviously that can kind of benefit buyers in the UK because they've got more buying power. Final section before we go on to the Q&A, just wary of time. So news and policy developments. I've covered a lot of this, but the ISCC and concerns over feedstock fraud. So I've mentioned the ISCC and issues there. It looks like the ISCC have kind of upped their game in response to these concerns. But there have been these concerns around palm oil mill effluent in particular. So the BBC ran this article that I mentioned. I've got a screenshot there. Basically around fraudulent claims of palm oil mill effluent versus virgin palm oil. I think the key consideration if you're a UK buyer of HVO is to look at the feedstock that your HVO is being produced from. I mentioned 92% of last year's product came from used cooking oil. It's very easy for you as a buyer to actually trace the product that your HVO was made from. So the ISCC verifies the kind of production side of things. Once you get into the UK market, there's an organisation called ZEMO, and they have a scheme called the Renewable Fuels Assurance Scheme, RFAS. So for every HVO delivery in the UK, an RFAS certificate is produced. So you as a buyer can ask your supplier for a copy of your RFAS declaration or the RFAS declaration attached to your HVO delivery, and it very clearly says on there what the product was made from, where it came from, and what the GHG reduction percentage is against diesel. So if you're moving to HVO and you're wanting to report the reduction in your GHG emissions, those RFAS documents are really, really helpful. So I think, yeah, the key takeaway from that is if you have concerns about the feedstock that's being used to produce your HVO, you can get the certification to assess that. There's also a investigation going on into US HVO imports. So the TRA are investigating this, Trade Remedies Authority, to make sure that the US isn't dumping products into the UK market and undermining the UK biofuels market. This is probably another reason why the UK is shifting back to the EU. But as I said, the cost of US products at the moment is meaning that a lot of products is coming from Europe rather than the US anyway. But just to kind of flag that there is an investigation going on into US imports at the moment. And then finally, I've mentioned this, but the SAF mandate. So as I say, that came into effect in the UK from January, and there's a potential impact there on UK HVO production because of feedstock competition. The flip side of this is, as I mentioned, there is a target in there for if we call HVO second generation biofuel, there's a target in there for what we could call third generation biofuel to be made to meet the SAF mandate, and that could be a good thing for the UK HVO market, because as suppliers have to advance the technology to meet the SAF mandate, they're going to be able to produce HVO from that process as well. So, I mean, we're talking a long way down the line, but we could be looking at potential increase in UK domestic HVO production if that happens, because at the moment there is very, very little product being made in the UK, which is why we're so reliant on either US or European product. So that is everything in terms of an update on the market. Obviously been through quite a bit there. I guess one thing just to flag as we're at the end of the presentation is that's a general overview of what's happened in the market. If you're interested in HVO specific to your own fleet and you're considering either considering transitioning to HVO, or you've already done it and you just want kind of some advice on your procurement strategy, that's where we can help as a fuel advisor, and we obviously partner with FORS to offer that to members. So please feel free to get in touch. I'll skip back to the Q&A slide in a sec, but we are offering these 30-minute free 30-minute advisory sessions. So if you want to contact us and have specific questions about HVO and use in your fleet, please take advantage of this offer. No obligation to do anything with us afterwards, but it's just 30 minutes of free advice on how you can buy HVO. But